that's why I love this format, because just tearing like a piece of watercolor paper in half and then folding it up, it's like so quick to make, and you can make a bunch of them pretty quickly. So to me, it's like one of the most accessible ways of just having like a nice format to work on that's all sort of compact. I made this one last night, just because I was watching TV all day. Actually, it wasn't just at night. I made this like throughout the course of the day yesterday. Um, but I was really just wanting to do something with my hands. You know, I was watching some TV and I knew that I wanted to play with some ink wash. I also just have I wanted to go ahead and start trying out some compositions for submitting a piece to a zine that my friend is putting together, around political printmaking. My friend Kate Laster is putting together a zine. And I was thinking of creating an ink wash painting that's kind of alluding to systems of climate change through surrealism. But in this one, I was using a lot of ink wash and just Liquitex paint markers. I can show you some more details on my little demo desk over here. But a lot of what I was doing in this is kind of like the idea I was talking about last class regarding automatic painting. So almost making marks in a way where you're almost doing it purely for the joy of making a certain mark, or maybe you're not even thinking about it at all. Maybe you're just scribbling on a side of your paper. So for this one, I started by just scribbling with this light blue Liquitex paint marker. And then from there, I kind of balanced it out with some more marks of the same color down here. And then from there, I kind of built up a system of lighting and shadow using my ink wash in order to create values and to create moments that are darker, kind of like the underside of this sort of like, it kind of looks like a big sort of like trash cloud to me. Here, I've really sort of built up some darker values, which then makes it appear like the light source is coming from the top. I then also added the same kind of light logic to these forms down here. And I kind of also just set the background into it more of like a light mid-tone by doing a light wash over it. So we're going to talk about using ink wash today, or sorry, using acrylic today, but how you can start your acrylic using washes. While at the same time, you can create some really lovely, more sort of opaque moments, where you have opaque color sitting next to opaque color in more of like an illustrative kind of graphic kind of way. So we're going to talk about how you can do both. But in these, I'm really just building up marks, and I'm also using the white of the page. So I'm using the white of the page in order to offer me the sense of lighting. So when I'm working with washes, I typically think of it more like a watercolor painting, and I'm working from lightest to darkest, or I'm starting with a bunch of the lightest values, or maybe I'm just throwing like sometimes I like to just throw a wrench in my process to give me something new to respond to. So I think with this one, I started by just making a big brush stroke with like a huge brush, and then dropping some ink into it in some large sections and seeing how it dispersed. So that's one option you'll have for this project, is to work in a more automatic way, where instead of planning out every single thing, maybe you want to, maybe instead you want to do several accordion books, or maybe 2 accordion books, where you're working really intuitively and you're responding to your marks as a way of building a kind of space. So in this one, I feel like, I don't know, and y'all are welcome to weigh in with like whatever you see in these. I feel like in my work, a lot of the time, I'm not quite sure what I've made until other people look at them, which is a really fun way of doing it. But I feel like I was really thinking about it sort of unfolding as I was responding to each mark as a kind of ecosystem. So as some kind of pool of some kind of body of water in the front here, some kind of like plants, or sort of some sort of like living thing sort of growing out of the land here. and then something that's either sort of geologic or maybe it's like an overgrowth of plants that are kind of like weaving their way through the land. I think what makes it kind of a space that to me feels more navigable or able to understand is kind of sometimes separating out figure ground relationships. So really kind of pushing this section back as a background by giving it a bunch of contrast from this section. But also here, because I had some marks that were kind of horizontal, I was able to then go in and kind of reiterate those marks to give it a feeling of perspective of moving back in space. So whenever y'all are working with abstraction, I think that like one of the most exciting ways to work with abstraction is to begin your process in an abstract way, but then to kind of try to establish some figure ground relationships or some moments where maybe one thing like this section is in front of the things behind it, or this section is in front of this section. And a lot of that is just building up contrast between different sections and contrasts of value as well as contrast of color, but also thinking about where is your light source is really helpful. So in each one of these paintings, even though they're super abstract and weird, there is a general kind of feeling of light and dark. So in this one, we really kind of imagine that there's maybe like a bright spotlight on the land from over here. So I encourage y'all, if you do want to work in this way, where you're working from more of like an abstract surrealist kind of approach at first, and then building it into representation from there, I really encourage you to start with just playing with materials, just playing with marks, and just having fun and seeing what happens, and then take a step back from it and ask yourself, okay, where's the foreground, where's the middle ground, where's the background? And how can I build some relationships by setting things apart from one another, or really putting the shadows on the opposite side of things from where the light source is coming. But I wanted to also just talk to you a little bit about, where's my book? Oh, here we go. Okay, cool. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about thumbnails. So here's the little goofy one I started last time. And again, I'm going to be working with my two complementary colors and white. So I've got my orange and my blue. I might use a different blue today just to try something out. Let's see. Luckily, I have a lot of different kinds of blue all around me. But I'll have some orange, some blue, and some white. And so this is heavy body Liquitex. These are golden fluid acrylics. And I don't know, I like them both for different reasons, but you can always water down heavy body acrylics to make them more fluid. But if you work in a fluid way frequently, then it can be nice and easy to just, have something that's already nice and fluid. So I'm gonna go ahead and start by mixing up a neutral. So remember that anytime y'all want to neutralize a color, all you need to do is reach across the color wheel and grab the complement. So when mixing something like skin tones, or mixing something like an earth tone, if y'all have ever painted a landscape and only used colors straight out of the tube, you've probably found that it was really difficult to make things look natural, to make things look illusionistic, because you were probably using very vibrant colors without mixing them enough. So whenever you're trying to achieve some kind of neutral color, all you need to do is reach across the color wheel and grab its opposite. And that's like just one of like the most important things I can tell you about color mixing and color theory, is how you can use complementary colors in order to create a variety of neutral tones. So let's see, maybe I want to make another version that's really mostly blue with a little bit of that orange in it. So I'm mixing up kind of a variety of some neutral colors. Then I can also take some white and I can make a bunch of tints of those colors. So remember that when you add black or add a darker color to one color, that's what you're creating is a shade. But when you add white to something, you're creating a tint. And you can use a variety of tints and shades, um, while also really kind of playing with the saturation in your just lovely saturated colors in order to get a wide variety of tones that have a great sense of light. And I've just gone in and added a little bit of this is Liquitex Slow Dry Medium, which just allows your colors to stay wet for, closer to maybe like an hour rather than like 5 minutes. It might be closer to like 30 minutes actually. So keep that in mind, that if you're struggling with your paints drying too fast, you can get some slow dry medium. Some people will also just put like a wet paper towel underneath like a piece of wax paper or something like that. And that can be a nice sort of trick. But what I want you all to first do before you really get into starting your accordion book is making some nice thumbnail sketches. And in a thumbnail sketch, the real goal is to try out some different compositions. So let's say your accordion book is roughly this long and separated into 4 sections. I encourage you to draw out the format of your book several times and then just think about, how do you want to activate it? So maybe y'all want to really create sort of like a sense of continuity from one page to the next. So maybe you want there to be some element that's really kind of activating space. Maybe there's like a lovely like orange cloud that you want to really kind of lead all the way through all 4. Or maybe you just want to connect 1 or 2 sections to one another. Or maybe instead of taking that approach, maybe you want to really kind of separate things out more like a comic book and really kind of plan out, okay, maybe there's one panel here that then breaks into another panel that maybe spreads across both pages, might be separated in the middle, but there could be some nice continuity here as well. So I really encourage you to think about just what kind of painting do you want to make? Do you want it to be more sequential, in red? Like, how do you want it to be read? Do you want it to be read like a comic book, or do you want it to be read more like a scroll? Regardless, I hope that what you make has some kind of sense of narrative, even if it's very abstract. So within these sort of tiny little boxes, you can then think about, okay, where do I want my darkest moments to be? So maybe I want to really block out some moments of darkness inside each of these little frames and really think about, where's my light source? But also, how do I want to activate the space around them? And I really don't want y'all to leave white space just for the sake of leaving white space, but instead, I really want you to think about how you can really build complex color relationships with your paints in order to make a really interesting and exciting piece. Maybe there's some sections where, even if you're working like in work of a comic book style, maybe there's some sections where there's like a big sort of figure that's like reaching over in between 2. This is like a bear, I think. Yeah, it's a bear. So maybe it's I think it's actually what's the word? What are those? A sloth. It's a sloth. Um, but I really encourage you in these thumbnail sketches to just very quickly, and using a nice small brush. This is just a small flat brush. But I encourage you to really think about how you're activating space, and also how, like, where is your light source? So if this is like a lit, and it's sort of like a kind of land here, maybe my light source is coming from here. I want to draw a little arrow. And then maybe the undersides of these mountain lakes or whatever, they're like both a mountain and a lake, I don't know. Maybe the backside, wherever the sun is shining or the light is happening, you want to think about how big shapes of shadow are going to be wrapping around the opposite side. And this can be kind of hard to get the hang of at first, but also think about how can your brush stroke appear to be wrapping around the form as well. So Now I can do a nice little lake here. But yeah, so with your thumbnail sketches, I really want you to just think about, um, you know, generally, how do you want to break up the biggest shapes of color? So I kind of like this composition here. So I might take this and put it on a bigger scale. So I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to use this as reference just from memory. Um, so this is kind of a messy accordion book. I'm going to try to give y'all a wider view of my table here. Okay, it's a little bit better. My studio is very messy. I've been painting with oils over here, so I'm trying to be careful not to get oil paint all over myself. But so then I might switch to a bigger brush because I'm working on a much bigger surface. So I have a nice big old bamboo brush, but you know, something that's quite a bit larger is going to be really important so that you can work with an underpainting that's general to specific. So if I know I want to have this big shape of orange, it's like a big orange cloud or something, that's sort of reaching all the way across, I can really water down my acrylic to create a wash. And then I can just, you know, put it down on there. And if it's in the wrong place, I can just take some white paint and paint over it and move it over. But when I'm in this stage, and I just grabbed a different brush, but it's still a pretty big one, I can also really think about building up my underpainting using some nice light watered down colors. So let's see, I might create like a sort of surface here. So maybe there's some like big cliffs, and really making this up as I go, so I don't really know what I'm doing, but it's kind of more fun that way. So I'm really kind of just blocking in some shapes, but if things aren't exactly where I want them, I can just, you know, take some water and I can just sort of like brush it away. See? So that's the benefit of working with an underpainting, is you can totally move things around. And in this stage of the process, things are incredibly fluid. I can make mistakes and then I can decide, no, actually, I want my line to come in a little bit more horizontal there. And I would dry off your paper before doing that though, because you'll notice it's kind of bleeding out. So now I've got these nice like sort of cliffs here, and I already can start to think about my light source. So my light source is coming in from over here, which means these sides of the cliffs, if it's coming from behind the cliffs, and I could even paint in like a little kind of light source right here. Here's a big old sun. If this, you can imagine that if it's creating rays that are hitting the other side of these cliffs and this land, then I'm going to have probably some highlights on the edges of the land. And maybe the top of it is going to be pretty illuminated. So there's going to be some like reflected color. So whatever color light you have might also be really influencing the moments of light. So maybe instead of just using white, you want to mix some orange into those colors, and have like a nice light orange moment of reflected color on the surface there. And one thing that I love so much about acrylic paint is you can just cover things up so easily, while at the same time you can be really fluid and gestural. So I'm just blocking in some nice sort of reflected light on the tops of these. And then because my light source is over here, these sections of land, which are like the planes that are going back in space, or the planes that are kind of like wrapping around this way, which is like the side of the cliff, those are mostly going to be in shadow. But I do think that like right where they hit the, you know, the edge, they might get bright. So I can go ahead and sort of map that out for myself. And instead of outlining things, it's going to create a more successful sense of color if I really bring that highlight all the way to the edge, because that edge is going to be like the brightest part. But then from there, I can really think about getting in there with some shadow. So I'm going to use some of this nice kind of like green neutral color, and I'm just going to pop it right into this plane here. And I can use my brush strokes in order to give my viewer even more information. So instead of just thinking about my brush strokes haphazardly, I'm going to use my brush strokes in order to accentuate the plane and the directionality of the surface itself. So if I were to be viewing this cliff, there would probably be kind of like this vertical, this is like a vertical plane. It's also kind of like straight out in space. So I could also, if I wanted to, use my brushstrokes to wrap around this way. You can also create like a woven kind of pattern of your brushstrokes. There's many, many ways to use your brush. But actually what I might do is create the horizontal brushstrokes here, which will help differentiate them from the more vertical brushstrokes right next to it. And that's what I mean when I say that you can really, I'm gonna grab a little bit more blue, you can really build up figure-ground relationships by creating differentiations between one surface or one section of your painting and the next. So how are you treating the color slightly differently than what's behind it, but also how are you treating the brush strokes slightly different? So, oh no. Okay, I need to plug in my phone in a minute, but we should be good for now. Welcome, Vanessa. So on this section, I'm gonna be doing these nice vertical brush strokes. And notice how this flat brush allows me to get right up to the edge there. And then I can clean it up a little bit if I want. But really thinking about the directionality of your brush strokes is going to give your paintings so much more visual interest, and it's going to just really allow you to build up successful sort of differences between one section and another. So I might then want to take some of that orange and sweep it around the edge here. Maybe I want to have the same kind of more horizontal, but I'm also following the curve of the mountain here to really kind of create that plane again. And then I want to bring in some of that neutral. So I'm really working wet on wet here. So I started from a very loose, just contour line underpainting drawing. And then I'm really kind of just building things up from there. I've done this lots and lots of times, so it's okay if you feel like you need to practice a bit before you really get into your final piece. It's also okay if you, in your underpainting process, you change your mind and you move some things around. You can always paint over things. So again, I'm really thinking about the directionality of my brush strokes, maybe bringing in some, my blue is really kind of like my darkest value. So I can bring some of that in there. I can also really just quickly create some more of those vertical brush strokes to emphasize that plane there and right over here. But yeah, so now I already have some figure ground relationships that I'm building up. The other things to think about is cast shadows. So let's say I have a person that is standing right here. Here's a lovely human. I can use some of my white paint to really make them stand out, but then maybe I want to grab a bunch of my darker tone, my darker value, or one of my nice saturated colors, and I want to really create some nice dramatic shadows on the back side of them. I can then also really think about where I want my cast shadows to come. So if my light source is coming in from here, I can use my brush to really kind of imagine the directionality of my cast shadow. So the cast shadow is going to kind of come out this way, right towards me. And if I have, let's say I have a figure that's slightly further away right here, and maybe a figure over here as well, those figures are going to be closer to the horizon line. As they get closer to the horizon line, which is about here, the placement of the feet are going to get slightly closer, or sorry, the placement of the feet are going to get closer to the horizon line, which is going to allow them to appear like they're further away. Then maybe I can have a person that's like even tinier up here. So the scale of my figures is shifting based on how where they're sitting in place. And this is like a really easy way to think about creating perspective. So here I have this sort of like crowd of people standing on this sort of ledge here, or this surface of this landscape. And then I can also add a quick highlight, you know, a quick moment of light or shadow based on where we're seeing the light from. You can also use your, I think my phone is like about to die, so I'm just gonna like speed my way through the last things I want to talk about. But you can also use your acrylic paint in a really opaque way. So I can just take some straight up orange, and maybe I want to make the entire background just like a really lovely solid color. So I can, instead of watering it down a lot, I can really just use my my orange tones. And I know I've kind of like erased my cloud. That's okay. I think I'd rather my cloud sit on top of a background anyway. So again, I'm thinking about how I can use the layering, the kind of order of operations of how I'm layering things in order to really build up figure-ground relationships. So I'm just moving around those figures there. And whenever you work with your paint more opaque, you're going to have a lot easier sort of ease of covering up brush strokes. So you'll notice like you can really see my brush strokes when I'm working transparently, but when I'm working with just like some nice straight up heavy body acrylics, it's pretty darn opaque, and I'm able to cover ground but also cover things up really quickly. And you know, I might want to do several layers, but this is also a way that I can like cover up that mistake I made earlier of putting my line in the wrong place. I can just cover that up with some nice opaque orange for my background. And now I have like some really solid figure ground relationships, where it's really making sense that I have the sky and then the land in front of it. And I'm doing this very quickly. You might take your time a little bit more than I am, to get some nice even edges, because I'm really slapping it on. But I can really create a lovely kind of separation between the figure and ground, or from what's in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Yeah, and so if I block in my sky a lovely super opaque color, and so we're really working with both transparent and opaque ways of working with acrylic, I can then think about taking some white or I'm going to take some of that, I think, neutral grayish tone. And then if I put a cloud in front of that, it's going to appear to sit right in front of the orange sky. So really thinking about making big blocks and really general blocks of color that activate big sections of your composition will then allow you to really go in confidently with your next layer. So then I can really kind of create some clouds that really appear to be sitting on the surface. Cool, does anyone have any questions about any of that? So starting with an underpainting, I'm really kind of, actually didn't work from back to front in this case. I actually worked more from I built out these structures first, and then I applied the background. But working from back to front is also a great way to layer. If you've ever watched a Bob Ross, that's how he does it, is doing the background first and then just building up layers into the foreground. So you can also do it that way. But also really thinking about, where is your light source? So the fact that my light source was over here, even though it's not super visible now, is what informed where my shadows went for every other section. And knowing where your light source is also going to let you know how your colors can interact with each other in a way that's illusionistic. So when we see color in the world, and when we see sort of anything, it's that way because of light. So because light is hitting objects or land or people. So when we're seeing the way that values or colors sort of shift around a form, it's because of the lighting scenario. So no matter how you're working, whether you're working in like a super abstract way like this, or a really super more representational way like this, even though this is super invented, I really encourage you to think about where is your light source. So if you're using a reference image, I really recommend you use a photographic reference image rather than like a graphic reference image, because your reference is going to ideally have a, a light source already in it. And that way you can use that light source um, from your photograph to inform all of the other things in your painting. So maybe you want to have a reference image of some kind that you are sort of integrating into your composition, but then maybe it's going to be partially invented and imagined. So um, I encourage you, no matter if you're working from references or you're working more intuitively like this, I encourage you to always remind yourself, where is your light source and how can that influence how you use color? Um, Also, really keep in mind the other thing, other important thing I touched on was the directionality of your brushstrokes. So how can your brushstrokes help to further kind of establish a plane in space? And a plane, when I say a plane, I really mean when you see a shape that is in perspective, and then it's sitting next to another space that's also in perspective. So kind of like this shape that's alluding to a sort of section of land here in this plane, those two shapes, because they're sitting next to each other with that kind of that same placement and that same kind of perspective, they're now functioning as a plane. They're now functioning to create volume in space. So you can really just think about the most general shapes, but if you think about how they're in perspective with one another, or how they're helping one another to build the perspective of a place, then they won't just function as abstract shapes anymore, but instead they'll function as a plane that has, is helping to create depth in space. Cool. Does anyone have any questions about any of this stuff?
I just want to check, when you mix too much water with acrylic paint, doesn't it start to kind of like break up a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a really great point. So acrylic paint, we have three main components. So we have a pigment, we have a vehicle, and a binder. So the binder is what sticks it to the surface, which in this case is plastic in acrylic paint. Um, and the vehicle is water. So when we add a lot more of the vehicle, it starts to break down the pigment in the binder, which means that if you do it too much, you're not going to have as solid of like a chemically bound layer of paint on your surface, because you're basically breaking up the thing that sticks your pigment to the surface. So I encourage y'all, if you get really washy with it, to go in with some like gloss medium, or this like slow dry medium kind of functions as both a gloss medium and a slow dry. It slows your drying at the same time. But if you do some acrylic layers of gloss or matte or slow dry medium on top of your washes, then you'll really kind of add that binder back into the mixture and solidify everything. So that's a really great point, because it's true that like if you are if you're treating acrylics like watercolor, you are kind of like breaking it down a bit. So I recommend using mediums whenever you can, as a way of either creating more transparency, or just adding some medium to your wash can be helpful, or just putting a layer of medium on top can also seal everything in nicely, so then you can do another layer. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Anyone else have any questions about any of these ideas? Try to fix this real quick. Okay, so If any of y'all showed up late, I recommend watching the recording, which I'll post really soon, because there are some really important things I talked about in this demo. I don't want you to miss out. But um, so that's the main thing that I really want to talk to y'all today is thinking about thumbnail sketches. So, oops, where are my thumbnails? Thinking about, just mapping out some really small studies to figure out how the heck you want to compose within your accordion book. Um, and also thinking about how do you want color and light to very generally activate your space. Things might really change in the actual accordion book. You might, I started with one idea and it transformed into something totally different. It's okay if that happens to you too. But I do want y'all in your thumbnail to really go ahead and just get in the mindset of thinking about generally, where is my light source and um, how can this allow me to start planning for separating space, for creating figure and ground relationships, or like the relationship between these figures and the space they're on, or the relationship between these cliffs and their background. How can you start to build up those relationships through creating contrasting moments of color and value? But also, you can, in your thumbnails, you can already go ahead and think about where is your light source, and also what kind of like time of day do you want it to be in the world that you're building. Do you want it to be like a nocturnal scene? Regardless, there should be some light, because that's how we see things, is with light. So even if it's a nocturnal scene, maybe there's a street light, or maybe there's a glowing like sci-fi being that's like illuminating the world that you're building. I really encourage you, no matter how abstract or weird you're getting with it, you've got to think about your light source, because that's what's going to create an illusionistic sense of navigating the world that's going to invite your viewer in. Because if you just have abstract shapes, yes, it can be fun, it can be all about the surface, but I really want you to think about, especially if you do want to bring in abstraction, to think about how can you use abstraction as a starting point to maybe build a world that no one's seen before. And applying logic of light and shadow, but also applying just some moments of perspective to your painting, even if they're really small things, or even if it's just a couple of relationships that are really important. Really creating some depth is going to be incredibly helpful in really sort of figuring out your concept, but also inviting your viewer into the space. And real quick, I just wanted to demonstrate one last little thing. So generally, if y'all one thing to think about with creating depth is if the size of your brushstrokes gets really tiny towards, let's say you've got like a horizon line about here. If the size of your brushstrokes is really tiny back here, and if your brushstrokes get bigger and bigger and more overlapped but also more saturated as they get closer to your viewer, it creates a sense of perspective. And that's another thing to think about, is you can create atmospheric perspective by allowing your more neutral colors to go further back in space, and then really allowing your super vibrant tones to be really overlapping each other and really kind of in the foreground. So is that making sense, that idea of overlapping? I just did a really quick like crowd painting, some people with long necks. Yeah. Cool. Any last questions about any of that? Or any of this? I also just wanted to quickly show y'all, and feel free to jump in if you do have any questions, but this is an accordion book that I've just started. This is nowhere near done, but I started it by actually just putting some bags of tea on the paper, letting them kind of seep in and then taking them off before it really dries. So you can also still kind of use some of those techniques that you might have practiced earlier on in the semester of like staining your paper. You might want to stain your paper before you even begin, just to give yourself an interesting, colorful ground to then build your painting on top of. So I've used these marks that the tea bags made as major sort of sections of my composition that now I'm going to really kind of figure out how to integrate into the whole. Or maybe I want to think about, am I looking at like an aerial view of something, or do I want to like give one of these things like a drop shadow underneath them like this, um, to give it like a really quick relationship to its ground. I love a good drop shadow. Eve's Tanguy and K Sage, who we looked at last week, are really cool to look at for like uh, shadow stuff. They made those really sort of desolate, uh, surreal worlds that we looked at. But now, because I dropped those shadows in, now we have like a field of boulders that are in perspective. Because I was thinking, okay, here's my light source. Boom, that's where my shadow is going to go. And generally, my shadow's roughly the same size as my object. But maybe you want to get some really long, dramatic, elongated shadows as well. Um, any other questions or ideas, responses? Anyone confused or concerned?